second Wednesday, I don't remember the date, second, we'll be making a presentation about the state of the economy, but also how they go about coming up with the numbers for the state of the economy, what kind of evaluation they do. The May,
oh, no, I'm sorry.
And in June, we're talking about the data, having the slotting into data visualization, which initially we were talking about something like a science fair, have people make a presentation or use a number of slides and say how would you improve this in terms of the data visualization approach. But yeah, so your feedback on that is very helpful. And I think we're wide open from July on. I know we have somebody later in September who did schedule somebody who I don't know.
October.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And if anybody would like to participate on the program, maybe we meet once, maybe twice a year, just let me know. And we start to develop what we have on our group typically likes, what I tell people, they are like numbers, are not afraid of numbers, and are willing to engage in rather technical topics, subject area range all over the word. So we're also looking for good presentations, good speakers.
I'm going to introduce you. Okay. All right. Now that we have slides, I'll introduce David Levinson. So I'm very pleased to introduce him. Professor Levinson was one of my first professors at the Health Institute when I was a student there, and I think it was your first semester there as well. So we were both new there. He was teaching my planning course at the Health Institute at that time. And one of the things I really appreciated then as now is Dr. Levinson's ability to explain complex issues, complex data with a lot of clarity, and also really encouraging the students in this class to question their assumptions and sometimes finding places where their assumptions didn't prove to be valid. So I really appreciated that. Today, Dr. Levinson's research focuses on the ways that networks grow and what that means for how we all interact and live, evaluating transportation technology and policy, and modeling travel behaviors. And then one other role that Dr. Levinson plays is he's the director of the Nexus Research Group, which explores issues related to networks and economics and growth. So I'm looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk about observing accessibility, and this is based on research that we've done over the last 10 years. 6 years ago, I was invited to the Wilder Foundation for one of the CCRG talks, and so I assume some of you were there, and so it will be focusing on things that we have done since then, but I'll go over some of the core ideas. And this is work that has involved a lot of different people, most notably Andrew Owen is in the back, is directing the Accessibility Observatory now, so some of the more recent work has his fingerprints all over it, funded by a number of funding agencies. So the questions start, why are we here? Or more precisely, why are we here? Okay, now, I'm here because you're here. It wouldn't do me a lot of good to be here if there were no audience. And you are here because I am here. It wouldn't do you a lot of good to sit in the audience if there were no speaker. So the question is, why are we at the Wilder Foundation? And the answer is to access the best researchers in the Twin Cities because we are all in one place. So often I'm asked to give the elevator talk of what is accessibility. So it is, in short, how many jobs, workers, people, stores, parks, schools, acres, airports, hospitals, or whatever activities you can think of that can be reached in some number of minutes, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, by some mode, car, carpool, walking, bike, transit, etc., at some time of day. Okay. Now, if you think about this cumulative opportunities measure, there are a lot of different dimensions here. Okay, the activity that you're looking at, the time threshold, the mode, the time of day. And if you were to multiply all these together, you get a very large number of possible combinations. And of course, we're doing this for every place. So if we think of places in terms of census blocks, there's 40,000 of those in the Twin Cities. So we're doing this calculation for 9 times 6 times 7 times 1,440 times 40,000 different things in order to calculate all of the varieties of accessibility. So I'm not going to show you all of those maps. We haven't actually calculated all of those maps. But you can imagine the different dimensions that we're looking at. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so we call it cumulative opportunities because it's a measure of how many opportunities can be reached in a given amount of time, the cumulative number. So if we think of ourselves at the center point, and there's 4 red dots that represent destinations that we might want to go to, when we're looking at cumulative opportunities, what is the 10-minute cumulative opportunities measure is how many of these places we can get to in 10 minutes. Well, none of the red dots are within the 10-minute circle, so the answer is 0. In 20 minutes, 2 of the red dots are within the 20-minute circle, so the 20-minute accessibility is 2, and the 30-minute accessibility in this example is 3. Okay? So that's all that we're doing. We're counting things that can be reached. Now, of course, it's more complicated than that because we need to know the travel times on the network and have everything mapped spatially. So this red blob, is there any way to adjust the lights in this room slightly? The reds are more differentiated than they look on this screen. If you're in this point right here near downtown Minneapolis, the different shades of red indicate how far that you can get in 10 minutes, in 20 minutes, in 30 minutes, and so on. So you can imagine that each of these, for each point, you can have a different spatial area that you can reach in a given amount of time, and we need to calculate that for each point. In this case, it was done via traffic zones, transmission analysis zones. We're now doing that at the census block level. So the advantage of cumulative opportunities. A simple count of destinations reachable within a threshold. So it's not an index, it's an actual thing. This isn't some abstract measure. It's not the log sum of destination choice model from a regional planning model. This is an actual number of things that we can physically measure that means something. I can explain it to you. You can 30-minute accessibility to 10,000 jobs means you can reach 10,000 jobs in 30 minutes. Not only can I explain it to you, I can explain it to a politician. Okay? And so this is really important because a lot of other measures that have been proposed to represent accessibility have failed at the ability of the public or politicians to actually understand what they mean and for the ability to actually measure them. And of course, we can look at different types of thresholds, we can look at different types of destinations, and they all mean something, and they can be compared appropriately. We can look at it across modes, which we will do today. So it's cumulative, comparable, so I can take the same number and see how many jobs can you reach in 30 minutes in the Twin Cities and compare that to New York City, and I'm comparing apples to apples. Many apples to big apples. Just make that up. It's clear, it's comprehensive, and it's calculable. Okay? So assuming we know the land use measures, assuming we know the network travel times, we can look at this. Now, where do we get network travel time data for? I mean, this is not the output of a model, although it could be the output of a model. We're looking at measuring this, observing this. So one of the data sets that we've used looks at highway travel times for all the loop detectors on the freeway system on the Twin Cities, in the Twin Cities region. This is something that MnDOT has collected relatively consistently since the early 1990s. They've expanded the coverage of their network. And so we know on each highway segment, basically for each lane, for every half mile or so, what the travel flow is, the number of vehicles crossing a detector, what the density, what percentage of time that occupancy, what percentage of time that detector is covered with a vehicle, and from that we can calculate speed pretty robustly. And so we have estimates of speed on the entire network, on the entire freeway network, limited access highway network. Doesn't help us on the arterials, though. So we need other data sets for the arterials. On the roadway side, okay, we'll be moving towards GPS data, and I'll show that later. On the transit side, we'll be using schedule data. So we have schedule data in a standardized format from transit agencies. For walking, we just need the network, and we just assume that people walk at a steady 3-mile-per-hour speed. We need land use data. So we're looking at, or in this case, this is traffic zones, but now for every census block, what are the number of jobs in each zone? What are the number of jobs in each block? For population or labor measures, what are the number of workers in each block, okay, which we know from census LEHD data? What are the number of people living in each block, which we know from the census? And we can see how this has changed over time. Okay. Putting these things together, we can calculate accessibility. As part of a previous project, we did this for 1995, 2000, and 2005. So we did this in the time period between 2005 and 2010. We measured accessibility for the Twin Cities region at the traffic zone level. And you can see that the 10-minute accessibility by auto in the AM peak period, highest in downtown Minneapolis. The yellow areas are reasonably high. There's actually some red dots here near some of the job centers. And we can look at the 20-minute accessibility, and it gets more red. In 30 minutes, you can reach most of the region from most of the region. 40 minutes, 50 minutes, and 60 minutes. And in 60 minutes, you can get from anywhere in the region to any job in the region in 2005. In 2005 is just sort of as a marker, is the high point of congestion. It's the high point of travel demand. There's more vehicle miles traveled in the region in 2005 than there was before, and then there has been since. Not to the nearest year, but to the nearest 5-year period. So, question, is accessibility increasing or decreasing over time? So one of the things that you can look at is accessibility measures for a given year. You can compare to previous years, and you can look at changes. And so we can compare, for instance, accessibility, this is within 10 minutes, between 1995 and 2005. So what happened between 1995 and 2005? Well, the region grew about 10% in terms of population, something similar in terms of jobs. But of course, congestion also increased over this period. So the areas that are red saw increases in accessibility, people could reach more jobs. Areas that are in blue saw decreases in accessibility, people could reach fewer jobs within 10 minutes. Okay? Within 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes. Overall, over most of these time periods, most of these time bands, accessibility increased. At the most local level, it didn't, where people tend to live in neighborhoods, and in neighborhoods, often we do not have very many jobs locally. So congestion effects might dominate. Over a longer time band, the network has gotten a little bit slower, perhaps on the freeway side, but not significantly. Certainly, there were some capacity additions in this period too, but the number of jobs grew, and that dominated the change in congestion effects. So generally, we can say, did accessibility increase or decrease? The answer is yes. For short trips, it might be decreasing, particularly in areas such as the East Metro, where the land use number of jobs was declining, and in areas where congestion rose faster than employment. But for longer trips, it definitely increased because the land use increases outweigh the changes in congestion. So why do we care about this? Right. So we know from various studies, a 1% increase in accessibility of jobs reduces average metropolitan commute times by about 90 seconds each way. So if you live in an area that has a higher accessibility, you're going to have a shorter commute. Higher accessibility to jobs, you're going to have a shorter commute, all other things being equal. A 1% increase in accessibility to jobs results in a 0.0575% drop in auto mode share. Okay? Not a huge amount, but it is in the right direction. And we see this even in terms of accessibility to jobs by automobile, because in places that are more accessible to jobs by automobile, they're also more accessible to jobs by transit typically, because the transit service will be better in these high-density areas. Property values reflect these gains. A 1% increase in accessibility to jobs raises the sale price of a home by about 0.23%. Data from the and doubling accessibility to jobs leads to an increase in real average wages of 6.5%. And this is data that was looked from national sources. So accessibility is an indicator of a lot of things that are really important. So we updated to 20, after we did the 2005 study, we updated to 2010. Andrew joined our group. We used GPS travel times. We got GPS travel times from a study that we did in 2008. You all recall that in 2007, the I-35W bridge collapsed. We got a project to look at people's changes in travel behavior as a result of that. Now, of course, we didn't anticipate the bridge collapse, so we studied it after the fact, but we could anticipate when the bridge would reopen, so we instrumented people's vehicles. We had 146 good observations from this study. We instrumented 146 cars with GPS units for basically the 2 weeks before the bridge reopened and 8 weeks after to see how they'd respond. Now, we did a lot of interesting research with that, but one of the nice things that we could get out of that was, well, these people didn't just drive on the I-35W bridge, they drove all over town, and so we had the first detailed GPS data set that we could play with for the Twin Cities region from these cars. So we had the cars had GPS units in them for 8 to 13 weeks, depending on the vehicle, and they drove all over town. So we got speed estimates not just on the freeway system, but on many of the arterials, and much better estimates of arterial travel times could be obtained based on this information, even where we don't have 15 observations. And so we calculated what does job accessibility look like in 2010 by car, and again, we see that as we get up to 60 minutes, it increases. And we look at transit. And we look at transit using transit schedules. And we can see that comparing the 20-minute transit accessibility to 20-minute automobile accessibility, these numbers are a lot less red. You can't get to as many jobs by transit as you can by car. And again, we can do this for all 60 minutes, and you can see that at 60 minutes, the region is not all painted red. So not everybody can reach every job in the region within 60 minutes by transit, the way they can if they have an automobile. And we can look at the ratio of these two things. So the ratio of jobs accessible, in this case, 40 minutes by transit to jobs accessible 40 minutes by car. And this is everywhere below 1. That is, there is no place in the Twin Cities region you can reach more jobs by transit than by car. It's not necessarily true everywhere in the United States. There are probably blocks in New York where you can reach more things by transit than by car. But this is true for the vast majority of the United States. And the best places were at about 40%. So you can reach about 40% of the number of jobs by transit as by car in the best places, and in most places it's much closer to 0%. We can look at this geographically, and so in this case by county, and you can see this would be not surprising. Hennepin County has a higher average accessibility than Ramsey, and Ramsey is higher than the 5 other counties in the 7-county region. So this was good. We decided to say, well, can we look at this outside of the Twin Cities in a systematic way? Can we take this national? So we began a study called Access Across America. And the first year we did this was 2013. We needed a surrogate because we did not have the consistent travel time data that we wanted yet. We're in the process. We'll talk about that, how we're getting that now. So we measured accessibility at the metropolitan level using, okay, so I want to say there's no math in this. There's one equation in this whole presentation, and you've seen this equation before, just not in this form. Okay, this is A equals pi r squared. Okay, that's all this is. Pi is 3.14. R is basically, instead of it being a spatial radius, it's a temporal radius. So how much area is covered in a certain amount of time instead of in a certain amount of distance. So we're looking at the ratio of the speed to the circuity. And the speed is the average network speed, which we have from other sources, not at the link level, but at the metropolitan level. And the circuity is something that we calculated for each region, which is a measure of the ratio of the network distance to the Euclidean distance. And so, there's one marker here. I don't want to use the wrong marker on the board. This is important. The next boat, right? Yeah, great. So this is my origin, this is my destination. This is the straight line Euclidean distance. This is the network distance. Circuity is just equal to the network distance over the Euclidean distance. And in this case, it's going to be approximately 1.4. But for more typical examples, it's on the order of 1.2 on average. But it's different in every place. So it's not always 1.2. It's just on average 1.2. And we take that and we multiply it by the average employment density. And that gives us an estimate of the accessibility of the representative traveler in a given region. And so calculated this for 50 metropolitan areas in the United States. And the columns are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60 minutes. And the numbers for Minneapolis come about where they should for the Twin Cities region, compared to what we had for the micro analysis that we did of the Twin Cities region. And we can take the look at the number of jobs reachable in 10 minutes. And some cities it's going to be higher, and some cities it's going to be lower. But small cities can actually do reasonably well on the 10-minute accessibility measure, because even if their city is only 20 minutes wide, if you can reach many of those jobs within 10 minutes, you might be doing better than a New York City, or as well as a New York City, which has a lot more jobs, but they're spread out over a large area. So cities like San Francisco do really well. But even cities like Salt Lake City do really well because they've got a fast network and it's a relatively small area. Okay. As you get out to larger and larger distances, the accessibility doesn't change much, because within 40 minutes, the representative traveler can reach the whole region. Okay. Not every traveler. I mean, if you live in the southeast corner, you can't necessarily reach the jobs in the northwest corner, but somebody who's living in an average area of the region could reach all of those jobs. And so we can rank the cities in the United States, the metropolitan areas in the United States that way. And the most accessible places include some of the largest cities. So it's not surprising that Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York come out in the top. Chicago. Minneapolis comes out fifth according to this measure. And I wasn't putting a thumb on the scale. That's just where it came out. And so why does it, this is basically a weighted average of the 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50, and 60. Why has Minneapolis come out so well? Okay, we're obviously not the fifth largest metropolitan area in the U.S., but we have a very fast network. So it turns out that the average speed that Minneapolitans drive is in the top 5 in the U.S. The other, only 4 faster cities are in California. Okay, and so Californians complain about congestion. They certainly have congestion, but they have congestion from a much higher speed base than you would have congestion in, say, New York City. That's because they built freeways out there where people can travel fast, and people are traveling all across the day, not just in rush hour. And freeways might be congested in one direction, but free-flowing in the other direction. And so even San Francisco and Los Angeles have very fast networks. New York, of course, has a very large number of jobs. Chicago is a very large metropolitan area. San Jose has similar attributes to San Francisco. Washington, Dallas, Boston, and Houston fill out the top 10. So this is interesting. We can compare this against congestion statistics, and it turns out that cities that have high congestion might also have high accessibility. And what people value is the accessibility. And so that's what I think we should be looking at when we're comparing cities. And more importantly, how do these numbers change over time? Not so much how do the rankings change over time, but is the city getting more accessible or less accessible? Congestion is an input to this because it affects the average travel speed, but it's not the only thing. So I put this out, published this in 2013. A gentleman from the city of Raleigh called me and was complaining, why are we 50th out of 51? There's 51 metropolitan areas. The intent was to look at the top 50, but we did this for 3 points in time, and the top 50 changed over those years. And he said, well, why are we 50th? We do so well in terms of our congestion measures and our quality of life measures and so on. And basically, the answer is you're small. Okay? And if you look at Raleigh, you're also dispersed, and your network is circuitous. And part of this has to do with how the census defined the metropolitan areas, and Raleigh is a composite of Raleigh and Durham and Cary and a few other cities. And in the middle of it is the research triangle, which is a lot of jobs, but it's surrounded by an airport and parks, and nobody lives in the center of this metropolitan area. It's sort of weirdly arranged. And that doesn't help their accessibility score much. And so this is where the top 10 cities are geographically. California does well, and large cities come out in the top 10, as well as Minneapolis. And we can compare this over time. So we did this for 1990, 2000, and 2010. And the accessibility from 1990 was the highest. The network was faster. There was a little bit less congestion. 2000 tends to be the lowest, and 2010 is in between, closer to 1990 than to 2000. So average American living in the top 51 metro areas can reach slightly fewer jobs by auto in 1990, but more jobs than in 2000. Auto speeds were faster in 2010 than in 2000, and about where they were in 1990. Job losses in these areas limit accessibility gains. So if you're looking at access to jobs and there are fewer jobs, your accessibility is going to go down, even if you do everything else right. Networks are more circuitous. So this is another interesting observation. In the center cities of many cities, the Twin Cities, for instance, we have a grid, and a grid has a certain circuity, and that's what it is. And if you live in rural areas, there's also tends to be a grid, especially in the Midwest and the West. Roads are laid out on a 1 mile square. But if you live in these suburban areas, then there's a lot of streets that are not nearly as orderly. And this suburban growth has been, on average, more circuitous than the rural networks that came before it, or the urban networks as well. And so we can see the changes in circuity and the increases in circuity over time. I talked about the rankings. And we can look at how these rankings have changed since 1990. Philadelphia, Miami, and Cleveland, and Detroit have fallen out of the list, part for obvious economic reasons, part they're displaced by faster growing cities, but in part they're not the winners in the new economy. And within the 10 and 20 minute time frames, the accessibility for smaller cities can be very high. So if you're from a smaller city and you're looking at this, you say, well, I'm in New Orleans or Salt Lake, you actually do reasonably well at the 10-minute accessibility. You can't compete in the 60-minute accessibility just because you're a smaller city, but there's no reason you can't compete on the 10-minute accessibility. And how do we improve it? Well, we make transportation faster, we make transportation more direct, and we increase the density of activities, locating jobs closer together and closer to workers. So that was a surrogate, and that attracted a lot of interest. And so we said, okay, well, how would we do this if we could do this at a more microscopic level in all of these cities? Well, we've been increasing the resolution of our analyses over time. So when I was starting out a planner in 1989, 1990, looking at the metropolitan Washington region, we had a network with 300 traffic zones. In 2010, the Twin Cities has a network for the planning purpose of about 3,000 zones. We're looking at networks for metropolitan areas that are about 40,000 census blocks. And the number of interactions that we're looking at is the square of the number of spatial units that we're looking at. So in 1990, we'd be looking at 300 squared as our matrix of the potential travel time interactions. In 2014, we're looking at 40,000 squared. This is a much bigger number. You can look at this in size of the number of links in the network. In 1990, we were dealing with networks on the order of 2,000 links. In 2000, we're dealing with networks on the order of 20,000 links. Now we're dealing with networks on the order of 200,000 links. So we're dealing with every street segment in the Twin Cities. We're using OpenStreetMap to do that. Okay. The data is getting larger. In 1990, we had about 100 active loop detectors. In 2000, there were about 4,000. Now, they haven't added a lot of loop detectors. Certainly they added loop detectors, but not a lot. The data sets that we're using now are GPS-based data, which are collected in real time from thousands and thousands of cars. So we're covering a much larger part of the network. Now, the coverage on freeway links is still not as good as the loop detector coverage, but off freeway links it's far better because it's actually coverage as opposed to an absence of coverage. And so we're putting these pieces of data together, our loop detector data, our GPS data, on the transit side, transit schedules, to calculate travel time matrices. We're taking our land use data, which is census data and census LEHD, longitudinal employment household dynamics data, which for every block pair, well, for every worker has their origin block and their work block, and with minor perturbances to protect privacy. But this gives us a very good micro data set, which gives us the land use data. With the travel time in our land use, we can calculate accessibility and produce these outputs. So, talk about some applications in transit. Use it for evaluation, for monitoring and management, for planning. But there get to be questions. What departure time do we use? Well, your accessibility at different departure times changes. Accessibility peaks just as the trip is about to depart, and once the trip has departed, your accessibility crashes. And you can look at it like this. This is a plot, I think Paul Anderson did this plot, looking at the accessibility at a bus stop off of Como Avenue near the University of Minnesota. So 7 o'clock, you have a given accessibility. You can reach about 50,000 jobs. As you get closer and closer to the bus departure time, in 20 minutes, you can reach over 100,000 jobs, and then the bus departs. Okay? And now within 20 minutes, you can't reach 100,000 jobs. Okay? You can reach very few jobs. If you miss the bus, you've lost your accessibility, and you have to wait to get a 20-minute accessibility. Now, you still might have a 40-minute accessibility that includes all of this, because your wait time might not be the extra 20 minutes plus the 20 minutes of travel time. But this is giving you an idea of the nature of scheduled services are different than the nature of continuous services, like you get in your car and your car is always there. There's still variations in of travel time by time of day, but it's not as stark as it is by transit. And there's various buses, so you see different buses are departing at different times, but the main bus, I guess this would be the number 3 bus, is sort of driving the accessibility pattern here. And so we can look at this, we can average it over the period from 7 to 9 a.m., and we can see what does accessibility jobs look like by transit in 2013, using not just one point in time, but the average over a 2-hour period at each minute. And the pattern looks like we'd expect, with higher accessibility in the center of downtown Minneapolis, a very high accessibility at some other important points like Snelling University, because the 94 bus will stop there and we can get you into downtown St. Paul or downtown to Minneapolis within 30 minutes, and other places. Okay, and we can look at how does it vary by location, and we can see that at suburban park and ride lots, it's very spicy, and in downtown, it's much smoother because there's a lot of service that's sort of in between all these times. So the variation in accessibility by minute is a lot smaller, and the overall accessibility is a lot higher. And we can look at how it varies. And places where it's yellow, light yellow, it doesn't vary very much. And places where it's dark, it varies a lot more. And we can look at this and monitor over time. So how did it change between 2010 and 2013? Okay, there was some change in employment, but mostly there was some change in transit service. We can see where there were increases in transit service because we're in green territory and there's a significant increase in accessibility. So, for instance, at I-35W and 46, an increase in transit service, and so people not just at that point, but who are fed to that point by buses, have a much higher accessibility than they used to. And there's some increases in Roseville, there's some increases on Central Avenue and Fridley, some other places, and then there's some decreases where there was a loss in transit service over that period of time. Andrew dreamed up a scenario where there was no number 6 bus, just as an example. What would happen if you took out the number 6 bus, which runs down to Southdale? And you can see where the accessibility losses would be. Well, well, they'd be in Edina, but they'd also be in areas around Uptown. Wouldn't affect much of the rest of the region, would a little bit, but not significantly. We can use this for planning, identifying scenarios and creating hypothetical schedules and then comparing it. So, accessibility is measuring the ease of reaching valued destinations. It can be used for evaluation, monitoring, and planning. Accessibility Observatory is doing research and implementation in that area. And one of the things that we're doing is now, as I said, doing this micro-level analysis across 50 metropolitan areas. So I'm going to show you 6 areas. This is the Washington, D.C. region. You can see the red line going out to suburban Montgomery County. You can see the orange line coming out to Vienna and Falls Church. The Arlington National Cemetery doesn't have much accessibility. So not only do very few people actually live there, you can't reach very much. There is a metro station there. It is the metro station with the lowest boardings and the lightings. You can look at the Seattle region. A lot of accessibility in the center of the region. Also some pockets in Bellevue, Minneapolis, and St. Paul at this level. San Antonio, Atlanta, and again, accessibility along the metro system in particular. Airport down here, other stops on the right. And we calculated the rankings of accessibility to jobs by transit in 2014. And we look at the top 10 cities, and not too surprisingly, New York comes out on top. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Seattle, Denver, and San Jose. And the top 7 of these cities all have extensive heavy rail networks. Sort of almost all of them, except for Washington, have first generation heavy, well, except for Washington and San Francisco, first generation, Los Angeles have first generation heavy rail systems. Los Angeles has built a significant subway system, as has San Francisco and Washington, but these are legacy systems here. And sort of the mileage of the Washington and San Francisco and the Los Angeles systems on the order of 100 miles of grade-separated rail network. New York completely dominates this list, though, and the accessibility here is about 4 times Los Angeles, even though the city is only twice as large. In this building, the Minnesota Compass Project took the data that we reached for the Twin Cities and looked at how the municipalities in the Twin Cities vary in terms of access to jobs by transit. And Minneapolis comes out on top. Not surprisingly, Lauderdale comes out second, which is surprising. Lauderdale is a few blocks just off of Minnesota 280. Which I guess can reach most of downtown Minneapolis within 30 minutes. Ridgefield, St. Paul, Falcon Heights, St. Louis Park, basically first-ring suburbs are coming in the top 10 list here. And I had to convert over to PDF, but if you go to Vimeo.com and look up Accessibility Observatory, you can see a set of movies which show how the accessibility varies by time of day over the 2-hour AM. You can see the throbbing of accessibility as buses depart and trains depart and then arrive again. So take this transit accessibility, say, okay, this is the Twin Cities transit accessibility. Well, this is a combination of the ability to walk to transit as well as the service provided by transit. We can look at the walk accessibility. Say, well, where can you reach the most jobs by walking? Again, not surprising, the center of the region, downtown Minneapolis, to a lesser extent St. Paul, some other job centers. Subtract these out, and you can get the measure of the net transit accessibility. How much accessibility is the transit network itself providing after accounting for people's ability to walk? We see that it's important in downtown Minneapolis, it's important in this ring, but there's actually a ring of lower net transit accessibility, which is an interesting pattern. see where the transit networks are most important. Again, Snelling University of Minnesota. We can do this at the state level, so we've done this. This is free flow speed. How many jobs can you reach within 40 minutes of free flow speed within the state of Minnesota? Yeah. The dark blue is water.
Well, and so I need to apologize actually for the water there, because I have a 10,000 light closing up, and it is really mapped out areas that are seasonally flooded. So we've got a lot more lakes now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. People don't, right. Well, yeah, I mean, people hopefully don't live in places that are seasonally flooded, at least not during the seasons when they're flooded. So, yeah, and the other thing, another artifact here is that this is the state line, which, yeah. So, yeah, typically in Lake Superior is 0 by car. We didn't calculate it by swimming. We can look at reliability questions. So we can look at, well, what is accessibility by car within 20 minutes of 50% top speed, median speed. We have data from TomTom for the Twin Cities region, and we're acquiring this for the entire U.S. And they give us speed percentiles. And so it's dark red in the center of the region. We can look at the 90th percentile speed, which is the slowest 10%. And you can see that the number of jobs that you can reach is a lot fewer. The dark red areas is a lot smaller. And you can difference them. And the difference between these two is the accessibility loss due to the unreliability of the network. And this creates a really interesting ring pattern. And you can correlate the ring pattern with the freeway beltway system, indicating that the travel time variability on the freeway system is much greater than the travel time variability off the freeway system, which isn't surprising to people who use the freeway system, but the cost that we're typically not considering when we're planning freeway networks. That we look at it sort of as an idealized case and say, well, this is the speed that we would expect to get. But 10% of the time you get a much lower speed, and that means that you can't reach as much, because on the freeway, if you're on a freeway and there's a crash, you can't easily get off of the freeway system because we don't have that level of redundancy in the network that we do on our surface streets.
And that might indicate also places where there would be good investments in high-speed bus or something like that as well, because it could take some of that variability off during congestion time.
Possibly. I think it would be an indicator of places where we need to look at making the network more robust, where we need to have a better set of surface street connections. I mean, the bus might, I mean, I don't say bus wouldn't work there, but I don't know that the bus would solve this problem for people who are still using the freeway system. It is potentially an argument for something like a min-pass system, because it gives people the choice of buying out of the unreliability of the system. The cost of that, of course, is variable, and then there's uncertainty associated with the price instead of uncertainty associated with the travel time. The question, which uncertainty do you want? And different times, different people want different uncertainties.
I'm sorry. Why is it red in the middle?
This is basically people who were affected by I-94 into downtown. So I'm guessing those are people who were affected by the Lowry Tunnel.
Okay, it's the same thing. It's just there's a freeway there. And
I believe so. You know, this is work in progress. This is from a working paper, versus this is published yet. But there's a lot of causes of unreliability in various places based on where people live and the accessibility that they can reach. And so people whose trips have a higher share of freeway distance in them are more affected by this loss, or have a larger unreliability in their network than people who have a smaller percentage of freeway time in their trips.
There are people that have to cross rivers to get to where they're working too. They're up there across the river, so there's fewer connection points into the city than down in other places.
Yeah, I mean that's an issue too. There's a reasonable number of river crossings, but the river crossings are certainly finite compared to the number of surface streets that are here. So that's a factor. And the question is, do those river crossings tend to fail? I mean, so even if you had very few river crossings, if those river crossings were reliable, that wouldn't be the cause. If those river crossings are unreliable, then it would be. Okay. We can look at other applications. This is accessibility by nice ride. And so you can look at how many jobs you can reach via the nice ride network. This was done in 2013, so I believe it's based on the 2012 network. And you can compare that with how many jobs you can reach by walking in that same area. And then you can look at the difference in where can you reach more jobs by nice ride and where can you reach more jobs by walking. And so nice ride is best in this ring around downtown. It creates the most increase of additional jobs that can be reached, because by nice ride you're traveling at 12 miles per hour, say, I think it's done 12 miles an hour, and walking you're traveling about 3 miles an hour. So in downtown you can reach most of those jobs either way, but you don't have to walk to a nice ride station to get to the job. When you get farther out, it's worth it to walk to the nice ride station and at both ends instead. And we can look at this for scenario planning. So we did a project for MnDOT a few years ago where we were looking at some alternative future scenarios based for 2030. We would look at what if we redistributed population growth and employment growth so that it was all inside the Beltway, so that everything that was here today stayed where it was, but all of the increments were allocated to inside the Beltway. What if, instead of it all being allocated inside the Beltway, we allocate all of it outside, all the growth outside of the Beltway, and then a mixture of those two. And we can look at the difference between, this is the difference between the 2030 and the 2010 employment. You can see where the growth tends to be and where there's some losses. And then this is what would happen if we allocated all the additional growth inside the Beltway for employment, and what areas would get it. It's proportional to the amount of growth that's occurring in those areas anyway. And then this is where it would go if it was decentralized. And then we looked at alternative transportation scenarios, a baseline, the planned network, a planned network plus comprehensive hot lanes, one with congestion pricing so that people would be choosing the shortest travel time path subject to everybody else choosing the shortest travel time path. So sort of our equilibrium assumption, but here they'd be choosing the system optimal path. And so that would change where they would be able to go. And then free flow, assuming that there was no congestion, because somehow we were able to make much more efficient use of our capacity. And we can see the changes in the networks are relatively modest in the 2030 network compared to today. Most of the links are the same, but there's some extensions. Kind of completed, a few other roads are widened, a few class changes. And look at some different transit scenarios, baseline, the plan, set of what if we implement the streetcar network, and this is just the Minneapolis streetcar network. I think Paul hadn't given theirs up quite yet. What if we went back to the 1932 streetcar network, and then what if we included a bunch of beyond 2030 transit links? And this is what that network looks like. Okay. Calculated this from travel demand models because we obviously don't have data for the future. For transit networks, we looked at schedules and made up schedules for future networks. And we compared the scenarios. And so here are the different networks, highway networks and transit networks. And the different colors indicate different land use patterns. And then this is the person-weighted accessibility to employment. And sort of the starkest thing that you can see here is that in all of the scenarios, centralized population, centralized employment leads to higher accessibility than any of the other land use patterns for a given network. The second best is centralized population, decentralized employment, the purple bar. Okay, so why would that be the case? Well, because right now we have a relatively decentralized population compared to employment, and so that increases the amount of commuting. If we were to decentralize the jobs, put the jobs closer to where people live, and put the additional people closer to where the jobs already are, we would be increasing the efficiency of the network and the number of jobs that people could reach, so we'd be increasing the average accessibility in those cases. If we're going to be comparing the networks, okay, free flow is obviously the best, so if we could somehow make everybody go faster, that would give you the most accessibility. Diamond lane networks and congestion pricing do pretty well as well. Expanding the network doesn't have a lot of difference over the existing network, and in some cases it's actually detrimental to accessibility. And on the transit side, we would get the most out of putting back the 1932 streetcar network with a high frequency. Okay, so we don't have good data on what the frequencies were in 1932. Not that it doesn't exist, but it's buried in somebody's file cabinet. But if you were to do that, you would have a much more comprehensive network with high-frequency transit service. Now, it doesn't technically matter what the mode is, whether it's on rail or on bus. What matters is where the network goes and how frequent it is. So we can measure accessibility, we can model accessibility, we capture the effects of both changes in land use and transportation. We can look at accessibility-based planning and policy, so we can look at which of our decisions are going to make accessibility higher, and look at that as a performance measure, and we can do alternative analysis that way. Okay, so we're getting better data. We're going to be acquiring GPS data from TomTom. Now, one of the questions is, why do we can get data for lots of things from public sector? Why do we have to pay a private vendor to get the speeds and travel times on our public networks? Why is that not a public data set? Is there some way to have public sector collecting speed data on these public networks? Now, we know why, because GPS data sets are all privately done, but this is sort of a failure in the public sector to be able to get this data. And perhaps there's some way of crowdsourcing this information, developing probe networks on using existing fleets to get a public set of GPS level data that's good for this kind of transportation analysis.
Would that be a statutory fix, or it's simply an administrative decision?
I think it's mostly an administrative decision. I don't know that there's a law could perhaps prioritize that, but I don't think a law would be required. I mean, for instance, there are thousands of public vehicles. They could be acting as probes, and somebody could be tasked with organizing that data. There are a set of fleets that operate by the goodwill of the city. For instance, car sharing. Okay, you could make all the car sharing vehicles share their data about what the travel time on the network was with the public sector. Okay. That would require, at the municipal level that it's regulated, that would require the municipalities to be on board. There's obviously coordination issues with that. I mean, if there weren't, it would probably already have happened. But I think that's something that we can look at. Now, that said, I mean, it's not that this is it's expensive, but it's not an outrageous charge. It's not like they don't have costs associated with collecting this data. But this is something that really should be public. We've got maps now that are crowdsourced OpenStreetMap. We've got transit schedules that are open access, but we don't have travel times on the network in the same way. Not necessarily. It depends on how that were implemented. So the simplest odometer tax would just be looking at how many miles you traveled without actually tracking which miles you traveled. You could have a more sophisticated one which gave you a discount for driving in less congested areas and charged more for driving in congested areas, in which case you need to track time of day, but you might also want to track the location. And people get funny about the government tracking where they're going, even though they're traveling on public streets, and even though they've got these private trackers already in their cars. People are changed. So we're continuously measuring accessibility across the U.S. We're putting a number of reports together. You saw the first auto and transit reports. We'll be doing this over the course of the year. We have a pooled fund project, which is now funded by 6 different states, including 6 different states, including Minnesota DOT. Thank you, Minnesota DOT. Wisconsin, Iowa, North Carolina, California, Florida, yeah, Minnesota, yeah. And so that's all good news for us. We've done a lot of work in the past. And if you're interested, go to ao.umn.edu or access, and you can see all of our publications. So with that, I'm done. Thanks. Questions?
What needs to leave now is good time to go. If you're willing to stay to take questions, that would be great.
Yeah.
You have to think for a while longer.
Back to your probably results slide near the end, probably demonstrated. Yeah. So, my interest is always around poverty policy and data. And I use other. But it seems to me that if you talk about this, neither the various stuff that's getting a lot of attention or the wealth and income gap that's getting a lot of attention, that could be overlaid on this, right? And I guess it's free flow, which rates highly when you're just thinking in aggregate, may exacerbate sort of disparities and gaps, and transit solutions so they don't have as big a
we're doing work looking at some of the equity implications now. Those results are not out yet, but we're doing work on that. As to whether the free flow exacerbates this or not, I would say that as long as we're using gasoline to power our vehicles, who knows what we do in 2030, but if we were using gasoline to power our vehicles, the free flow would presumably have emissions effects, particularly along roadways, which could be worse than other cases. It's not clear. It's complicated. But if it were, worse pollution along highways, that would affect poorer folks more than it would affect wealthier folks, because wealthier folks tend to live upstream of pollution. That's the point of being wealthy.
But isn't it free flow as soon as you've got a car?
Right. Most people. Right.
It's built around that car.
Right. And would that exacerbate inequities? Well, to the extent that people who had cars were now doing better, yes, it wouldn't necessarily mean that anyone was doing worse, because if the highways are free-flowing, the buses that are using the highways are also free-flowing. A. B, most people have a car, including poor people. I mean, it's auto ownership at the household level is 90-something%. So the answer for poor people is not necessarily fixed route transit. It might be fixed route transit. It depends. And so I wouldn't want to sort of assume that that's necessarily the answer. In certain places it certainly would be, but others it wouldn't be. I mean, if you're trying to get to suburban jobs, that's not going to help you very much. If you're trying to get to downtown from a place that's in a relatively high density area already, it might very well be the most cost-effective solution.
Following a little bit on that, do you have data that identifies the time required to get to entry-level jobs from lower income communities?
We are calculating that right now. Andrew, is that still crunching? Chelsea's working on this.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, we're looking at breaking down jobs by income category and workers by income category. We're also have another project where we're doing it by economic sector. So insurance versus retail versus other types of, for instance, I think there's 20 different high-level sectors that we're looking at, and how are those connected? So I think there might be some interesting results there. The average accessibility of low-income workers is actually relatively high because low-income folks tend to live in urban areas with higher accessibility. The problem might be the spatial mismatch question of where are the jobs that they might need to go to. But my sort of rationalist economic view of this is if it was valuable enough for the firm to find them, and if the firm in the suburbs is complaining they don't have workers, they should raise their wages rather than rely on public subsidy. And then the workers can find a means of transportation with a higher salary that's being offered and decide whether or not to take that job. And if they're complaining without actually raising their wages, then it's obviously not hurting the firms in the suburbs any. From the point of view of the workers, it's a different question. But from the point of view of the firms, I think you need to distinguish complaints from actual problems.
Is that analysis that you're doing for the metro area or statewide?
It's for the 7-county metro area. There's no reason in principle, FLEHD data, there's no reason in principle it couldn't be done statewide. It just hasn't been.
Yeah, most of the state doesn't have transit systems, so transit isn't meaningful. But on the auto side, given that you get that as far as really for the whole.
Was a lot of the 3-year American Community Survey data affected at all? They don't use that, but I don't know.
No, obviously more data the better, but we're not using that data for this analysis. We use that for get mode share data. As for work trip mode share is probably the most valuable thing that we use from that set. What we would like to have are continuous data sets like that, but at a more detailed level, like a continuous travel behavior inventory or a continuous national household transportation survey, so that every year there be updates to those numbers. So having it be continuous is valuable, but our data, the LAHD program is what this is mostly based on from the land use side. So if we lost that, that would be tragic for our perspective.
I was going to say, does this work overlap reduction at all with the sort of H+T, like they're looking at that affordable housing, affordable transportation?
I'm familiar with the various versions of the H+T work. Time is the difficulty there is distinguishing what are choice versus what's necessity, right? So housing costs have a lot of option in them. And so saying that the average cost in the suburbs is higher than the average cost in the city doesn't really take that out. And we're looking at the number of jobs that can be reached. We're not looking at the cost of housing or the monetary cost of transportation. I've got other projects that have looked at those things, but this isn't looking at that. So there are different types of questions. And I think combining them is difficult. For instance, even just combining transit accessibility plus auto accessibility is difficult. So what do you say? Your accessibility is whichever is the maximum of those two? Well, then it's almost always the auto accessibility. So that's not getting any information. So even combining these kinds of things is difficult. And I'm just sort of leery of trying to combine everything into a single index. I realize it has rhetorical advantages, but I think you're losing a lot of information when you do that.
You mentioned earlier that there's impact on property value. I didn't know how far you've gone down that path.
Yeah, so we've done hedonic regression models, so basically looking at trying to explain the price of a house per square foot as a function of the attributes of the house as well as its locational attributes in terms of accessibility. And we've done this. We did this. We've done a few different models in Minnesota. Other people have done these kinds of models other places. The 0.23 comes out of a Twin Cities model, but we've looked at this in other areas, and that's typical. There is a positive value to the accessibility. This is one of the questions you asked about road pricing or mileage-based user fees. If you were to actually charge the real cost of roads, the real estate value of the accessibility would diminish because we'd be charging, the gains from the transportation system would be accruing to the transportation system instead of to the real estate system. Okay, so there are gains from transportation, and now people pay a premium to land to take advantage of them. But if we charge more for transportation, the premium to land would go down. So how we price transportation affects real estate values and that kind of thing. And I think that's, I don't know how serious we are going to be about changing our transportation funding system over the next 10 years. But if we do, we would see significant effects elsewhere in the system. People consider all of these things in making real estate purchases.
A couple of questions related to transit accessibility. Do you now have the ability to model what a required transfer for a trip puts into it?
Yeah.
And the other question is with the bus rapid transit coming in and reducing the frequency of the local bus, do you have the capacity to look at that?
Yeah, all of those are, in an accessibility calculation, all of those things would be considered. So we're starting from your home, and knowing you have to go to a destination. We find the shortest travel time path between your home and destination, considering multiple different routes that might get you there, one of which might be direct but infrequent, so you'd have a longer waiting time, one of which would have a transfer, and we would assume that the time transfers work. Okay, so it's sort of a, one could make it more sophisticated and have some probability of failure on a time transfer. We're not doing that. We're just assuming that the time transfers work and that schedule adherence is there. And walking to your destination would be another option as well, and if your destination is close enough, that might be the best option. So we're considering all of those things. We're considering, so when you replace out, we have not looked at, for instance, the A-line directly in this, but there's no reason we couldn't if someone said, hey, look at the A-line.
Right.
And we could say, well, if the frequency goes down from whatever it is to every 10 minutes or every 15 minutes.
It's going to 30 minutes.
The local would lose frequency.
The local is its frequency, yes.
Yeah, but then there are limited places you can get on that.
Right, so you have a higher walk access cost,
Yes.
which have a lower.
Yeah,
right.
So how does that play out?
Yes, and and we're doing this assuming that everyone can walk on average at 3 miles an hour. Now that's true for the average person. The average person probably walk faster than that, but that's not true for everybody. So again, you could differentiate. You could look at different populations based on ability. We haven't done that, but you could look on different populations based on their walking ability, physical ability, and see who would be affected. Now, I don't know of a good data set of identifying how many people of various physical abilities live in various places. Such data sets might